History remembers Queen Elizabeth I as a triumph, a golden age, a woman who outlived her enemies and reshaped a nation. But history is written by those who remain standing. It rarely pauses to ask who had to disappear so that victory could look clean. When Elizabeth took the throne of England, bells rang and crowds celebrated. Yet in a quiet chamber elsewhere, another queen was still breathing her final hours, and most of the court had already moved on. Power does not wait for death. It simply walks away early. This is not the story of the woman who won. This is the story of the woman who was erased, and the one person who refused to leave when erasure became convenient. Before Elizabeth became the symbol of survival, there was Queen Mary, daughter of a discarded queen, declared illegitimate by her own father, stripped of title, forced to live as a reminder of a past England that the world wanted forgotten. Mary would rule, briefly, fiercely, and then she would lose everything again. By the time her body began to fail, the court had already chosen its future. Corridors grew quiet, faces disappeared, loyalty shifted without a word being spoken. In that moment of abandonment, history usually turns away, because there is nothing glorious about watching power die. But someone stayed. Not a general, not a noble, not a rival. A woman without a crown, without authority, without a voice in the official record. Her name was Jane Dormer. She stood close enough to power to see how fragile it truly was, and far enough from it to understand its cost. Jane would witness the fall of one queen and the rise of another. She would be offered safety. She would be offered survival. And she would refuse the one thing history always demands: silence. This story is not about who ruled England. It is about who chose not to forget. If you want to hear the side of history that victories try to bury, stay with this story and subscribe to the channel. Mary Tudor entered history long before she ever entered power. She was born in 1516 as the only surviving child of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. From her first days, she was treated not as a daughter, but as a political certainty. Foreign courts addressed her as the future Queen of England. She was educated in languages, statecraft, and theology. She was raised to rule. For nearly 2 decades, no one questioned her place. Then England changed its mind. When Henry VIII decided to discard Catherine of Aragon, the break was not only marital, it was legal, religious, and personal. The king did not simply replace his wife. He dismantled her existence. Catherine was stripped of her title, removed from court, and forbidden from seeing her daughter. Mary was forced into an impossible position. She was ordered to accept that her parents' marriage had never existed, that her mother was no longer queen, that calling herself a princess was an act of rebellion. To obey was to deny her own blood. To refuse was to invite punishment. Mary refused. The consequences were swift and deliberate. She was declared illegitimate by Act of Parliament. Her household was dissolved, her servants dismissed. She was removed from court and placed under surveillance. Letters from her mother were intercepted. Visits were forbidden. When Catherine of Aragon died in exile, Mary was not permitted to attend the funeral. This was not weakness breaking her. It was reality reshaping her. From that moment, faith ceased to be private belief. It became identity. It became resistance. It became the only ground that could not be legislated away. Mary learned patience not as virtue, but as survival. She learned how to endure humiliation without surrender. She learned that compromise was not neutral. It erased people. When she finally ascended the throne in 1553, she did not inherit a stable kingdom. She inherited a country already transformed. The church had been severed from Rome. Loyalty had been redefined. Obedience mattered more than legitimacy. Mary ruled as someone who had already lost everything once. She believed that yielding even slightly would invite erasure again. Her rigidity was not cruelty. It was memory. It was fear sharpened into certainty. History would later reduce her reign to fire and failure. It would label her without explaining how she was made. This was the monarch Jane Dormer entered the service of. Not a tyrant, a survivor formed by displacement. Jane did not arrive at court to judge Mary. She arrived to observe, to learn how a crown could be taken away without a blade, how legitimacy could be rewritten, how truth could become illegal. Jane stood at the edge of history, watching a woman who refused to forget what had been taken from her. And quietly, she learned what it costs to remember. Jane Dormer did not come from nowhere. She was born into a family that understood how dangerous history could be when it changed its mind. The Dormers were landowners in the English countryside. Old blood, quiet wealth, Catholic by tradition, in a kingdom that was slowly learning to punish memory. Her father had served the crown long enough to know when loyalty should be spoken and when it should be hidden. Her mother came from a lineage that valued education, discipline, and faith carried inward rather than displayed. Together, they raised their children with one unspoken rule: never be the first to celebrate a victory that is not yet finished. Jane grew up in a household where caution was not fear, but skill. She learned early that power was temporary and visibility was dangerous. The walls of her home held prayers that could not be spoken outside. Conversations ended when unfamiliar footsteps approached. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just constant awareness. She was not taught to rebel. She was taught to endure. Her parents did not prepare her for glory. They prepared her for survival inside shifting systems. They taught her that kings change policies faster than people change beliefs. That what is praised today may be condemned tomorrow, and that memory once surrendered can never be reclaimed. Jane learned to read people before she learned to trust them. When she was sent to court, she did not arrive dreaming of influence. She arrived trained. She knew how to listen without reacting, how to remember without recording, how to be present without being claimed. She watched how loyalties were performed rather than felt, how devotion followed advantage, how faith could become a liability overnight. Court life confirmed what her family had already taught her. Victory was loud. Defeat was erased quietly. Jane understood that choosing a side too early was a form of vanity. Those who rushed to declare allegiance often did so because they wanted to be seen. Jane wanted something else. She wanted to remain intact. So she practiced restraint. She did not repeat rumors. She did not display outrage. She did not celebrate when others did. She learned the discipline of stillness, the discipline of remembering what others agreed to forget. This was not emotional loyalty. It was internal discipline, the ability to remain consistent when the environment demanded convenience, the ability to carry truth without insisting it be acknowledged. Jane was not shaped by ambition. She was shaped by caution, sharpened into clarity. By the time she stood near Queen Mary, she already understood what was happening. She knew how erasure worked. She had seen it practiced in families, churches, and courts. She recognized it when people began to leave before they were asked. Jane Dormer was not waiting for history to reward her. She had been trained for something else entirely. To remember when forgetting became profitable. By the time Queen Mary I of England began to die, the court no longer revolved around her. Her decline was slow and unmistakable. Illness confined her to her chambers. Pain drained her strength. Days blurred together in long intervals of exhaustion and wakefulness. And as her body weakened, the world outside her door quietly rearranged itself. The court did not wait for death. Whispers traveled faster than proclamations. Conversations shifted tone. Names were spoken with caution. Messages began to move toward Hatfield rather than Whitehall. Elizabeth Tudor had not yet taken the crown, but the future already bore her shape. This is how power truly changes hands. Not with ceremony, not with announcements, but with distance. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Queen Mary I now spoke of stability and continuity. Courtiers measured their words. Advisors calculated timing. Servants noticed which doors no longer opened. The reign was ending before it ended. Queen Mary understood this better than anyone. She had lived long enough to recognize abandonment dressed as courtesy. She had seen loyalty evaporate once before when her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was erased from public life. She knew what it meant when people began to behave as though you were already history. Her chamber became the final space of truth. There was no throne there, no authority, no illusion of control. The crown existed elsewhere now, in anticipation rather than presence. All that remained were memories and the knowledge that those memories would soon be judged by people who had not shared them. Defeat does not begin with death. It begins when witnesses leave. Jane Dormer recognized this moment instantly. She watched the court empty itself of obligation. She saw how grief was postponed and replaced by preparation. She heard how Queen Mary I was spoken of increasingly in the past tense while she was still alive. And Jane stayed. Not because she believed Queen Mary would recover, not because she expected gratitude, not because of politics or blind faith. Jane Dormer stayed because she understood the final danger of defeat. When power collapses without witnesses, the defeated are transformed. Complexity is stripped away. Motives are simplified. Failure is recast as guilt. The lost are no longer remembered as human, but as warnings. Jane refused to allow that transformation to occur in silence. Inside the chamber, Queen Mary I was no longer a monarch issuing commands. She was a woman confronting the certainty that her life would be explained by others. She spoke less. She observed more. At times, she seemed to measure how quickly the world was preparing to forget her. Jane did not speak to reassure. She did not argue against the inevitable. She offered something rarer: presence. She remained when staying offered no protection. She remained when leaving would have ensured safety. She remained when history had already begun to move on. Because Jane Dormer understood something courts prefer to deny. If no one remains to witness defeat, then defeat becomes a crime. And she would not allow Queen Mary I of England to vanish without a witness. When Queen Mary I of England understood that her reign would end without restoration, she turned her attention to what history would do next. Power can be seized, titles can be reassigned, but symbols tell the story that survives. Among her final instructions was the fate of her royal jewels. These were not ornaments chosen for beauty alone. They were objects that had passed through generations of English queens. Rings worn at coronations, pearls associated with lawful succession, emblems that carried legitimacy even when words were disputed. Queen Mary did not order them hidden. She did not command them destroyed. She did not attempt to deny their future. Instead, she ordered that they be delivered intact to her successor, Elizabeth Tudor. It was not an act of surrender. It was an act of control. Mary understood something that many defeated rulers never do. If the symbols vanished, history would describe her fall as theft exposed. If they were withheld, she would be remembered as bitter and illegitimate. The story would not be about law or succession. It would be about possession. She refused to allow that. By choosing to pass the symbols forward, Queen Mary forced history to confront an uncomfortable truth. Power had changed hands, but it had not been stolen in the dark. The transition would occur in daylight with witnesses. This responsibility did not fall to a council. It did not fall to a noble. It fell to Jane Dormer. Jane understood immediately what was being asked of her. To deliver the jewels was to acknowledge Elizabeth Tudor as the reigning authority. To walk into the presence of the future queen carrying the symbols of the old reign was to close the chapter with her own hands. But to refuse would turn Queen Mary into something she had never been. A defeated woman clinging to symbols after losing the substance of power. Jane recognized the trap. If she kept the jewels, she would preserve loyalty at the cost of dignity. If she delivered them, she would preserve dignity at the cost of alignment. There was no option that allowed her to remain untouched. Jane chose clarity. She prepared the jewels with care. She treated them not as property, but as testimony. Each piece was secured not for protection, but for presentation. This was not an offering. It was a record. When Jane left the chamber, she carried more than gold and gemstones. She carried the final argument of a reign. That Queen Mary, the First of England, had ruled lawfully. That her authority had not been seized by force. That succession had followed order even when ideology divided the realm. Jane did not take comfort in the choice. She did not frame it as reconciliation. She understood exactly what it meant. She would deliver the legacy, but she would not join the victory. Jane Dormer would not become part of the new court. She would not allow the act of transfer to be interpreted as allegiance. She would not let the future claim her silence as consent. This was the line she would not cross. By handing the symbols forward, Jane ensured that Queen Mary would not be remembered as a thief stripped of power. She would be remembered as a ruler who left the stage without stealing the crown on her way out. Jane Dormer did not choose the winning side. She chose the version of history that could not lie about how power changed hands. Elizabeth I of England did not need to announce her authority. It was already understood. She had survived what others had not. She had learned flexibility where rigidity had failed. She had watched her sister rule with certainty and fall with certainty intact. Elizabeth understood power not as belief, but as balance. When Jane Dormer was brought before her, the moment was outwardly simple. A transfer completed, a reign closed, a new one beginning. But Elizabeth did not look at Jane as a servant finishing an errand. She looked at her as a problem. Jane Dormer was unusual. She had served Queen Mary I until the very end. She had delivered the royal jewels without hesitation. She had obeyed the instruction perfectly, and yet she had not aligned herself with victory. Elizabeth recognized this immediately. This woman had seen both worlds, the reign that lost and the reign that would last, and she had not been reshaped by either. Elizabeth had built her survival on reading people accurately. She knew ambition when she saw it. She knew fear. She knew opportunism. Jane displayed none of these. That made her dangerous. Elizabeth understood that loyalty was a resource, one that could be redirected, one that could be rewarded. Most people wanted security. Most people wanted proximity to power. And most people could be absorbed. So Elizabeth offered what history always offers at moments like this. Continuity. She did not threaten. She did not pressure. She simply allowed the future to speak for itself. Service meant safety. Presence meant survival. Staying meant relevance. It was an invitation framed as generosity. Jane understood the offer perfectly. To remain would mean comfort, protection, acceptance. To serve Elizabeth I would mean erasing the final distinction between witness and participant. It would mean allowing Queen Mary I to become a failed prelude rather than a legitimate reign. Jane could not accept that. She did not respond with defiance. She did not accuse. She did not explain herself through ideology. She answered with restraint. She made it clear that her service had ended, that it belonged to a reign that had closed, that she could not stand beside victory if doing so required the quiet removal of the defeated. The court did not react. It waited. Elizabeth did not raise her voice. She did not show anger, but she understood what had just happened. Jane Dormer was not refusing employment. She was refusing permission. Permission for history to simplify. Permission for memory to be edited. Permission for defeat to be treated as shame. Elizabeth saw this, and she did not press further. She knew when a person could not be bent without breaking something more valuable. Silence followed. Not awkward silence, not confusion, but recognition. Two women faced each other across a line neither would cross. One would rule by adaptation. The other would depart rather than compromise witness. Elizabeth I of England would go on to shape a nation. Jane Dormer would step away from it. The court moved forward. The future continued. And in that heavy, quiet moment, it became clear. Some people cannot be bought because they are not for sale. Jane Dormer did not leave England in disgrace. She was not expelled. She was not condemned. No decree forced her to go. She simply understood that there was no place for her in the story that was about to be written. Elizabeth I of England would rule for decades. Her reign would be remembered as stability and survival. Historians would praise her restraint, her intelligence, her ability to endure. England would move forward, and history would move with it. Queen Mary I of England would become something else entirely. A cautionary figure, a warning, reduced to a single word that erased complexity and pain. And Jane Dormer would almost disappear. She did not fit the narrative of triumph. She did not fit the narrative of failure. She did not belong to the future, and she refused to betray the past. So she left. Not because she had lost, but because staying would have required forgetting. Jane carried no crown with her, no title that history would celebrate. She carried memory. She carried the final days of a queen whose story would be simplified by others. She carried the truth of how power leaves before it dies. She carried the knowledge of how loyalty is tested when there is nothing left to gain. Jane wrote. She remembered. She spoke when silence would have been safer. While England moved on, she preserved what it chose to abandon. Not in proclamations, not in monuments, but in witness. History does not reward people like Jane Dormer. It rarely names them. It prefers clean endings and clear villains. But without people like her, history lies more easily. Because when only the winners are remembered, defeat becomes guilt, loss becomes shame, and complexity disappears. Jane Dormer lived a long life far from the center of English power. She did not return to claim relevance. She did not ask to be restored to memory. She had already chosen her role. Not as a hero, not as a martyr, but as a guardian of truth that could not survive inside official history. Elizabeth I of England would be remembered. Queen Mary I of England would be judged. Jane Dormer would be overlooked. And yet without her, something essential would be missing. Not every person is born to win. Some are born so that history cannot lie to itself. If this story changed how you see power, loyalty, and memory, if you believe the quiet witnesses matter as much as the crowned winners, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are waiting to be remembered.